want to know what you're fighting for. Podcast by George. 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 Oh, yeah.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Big news this week. I mean, super big news with me because I've been following this all along. I've had it on the podcast several times. I don't think people are putting enough weight in how important this is. It is the trial of Julian Assange, the United States trying to extradite him on espionage-related charges, and he's in a court of law where they're in Britain, the UK, deciding whether or not he can be brought to the United States, and if he is, it ain't looking good for Julian Assange. Well, happy days are here again. I saw the headline that the extradition was blocked for Julian Assange, and I thought, oh my God, this is great. Well, and I read like the next paragraph, like, what? I don't know. This is kind of a mixed bag. And I thought, well, we got to get our Assange expert back on Podcast by George. And folks, it's Dr. Jasmine McNeely. She's a scholar of media and technology with a view toward influencing law and policy, an associate professor in the Department of Telecommunications at the University of Florida's College of Journalism and Communications. She earned a PhD in mass communication and a JD at the University of Florida and a BS in both journalism and Afro-American studies at the University of Wisconsin. And all of that's important, and it all plays a role in this because this is important on a lot of different levels. It's huge journalism news. It's huge legal news, and it has a lot to do, I think, with the future of this country because the First Amendment is really important, folks. Let's welcome her in. Dr. McNeely, welcome back to a podcast by George.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, because of your unique qualifications and your willingness to play along here with us on the podcast, come back another time. I want to give you the kind of the first word and the last word on this. I explained kind of my initial reaction to this. What was your first take?
So on the extradition or the lack of the ability of the United States to extradite Assange, I'm not completely surprised. European courts and the UK is still a part of Europe, even if it's not a part of the EU anymore, have a tradition of examining the human rights aspects of things like extradition and criminal sentencing. That doesn't mean they always get it right, but they do examine those things. And so it's not unprecedented that they would consider things like health, which is what they decided, or the judge decided was important here, that Assange is not in the greatest health and that he might try to kill himself if extradited to the United States. So that's not surprising. The bail thing can be considered a little surprising, although he was in jail for skipping bail. So that's still not that surprising. And the judge is concerned that he might, I don't know, find another embassy to take refuge in, or, go to another country, whatever the case may be. So that he's stuck in jail a little longer is not totally surprising either. So,
well, yeah. Let me stop you right there and ask you again, and your expertise is going to be in American law, obviously, and there are some differences in the UK, but I've got some experience with the American court system. I mean, I used to be a police and fire reporter for one thing. I know kind of how these things work, and I was always bemused by the fact that people would have a charge of like failure to appear. And they would think, oh, that's no big deal. That'll just be dropped. Not necessarily, folks.
No,
Judges hate failure to appear. They hate it when you jump bail. They tend to frown on that mightily. Is that going to also work against Assange? Will that be the case in the UK?
Well, it won't work against them with respect to the actual case, the substantive case against them, but it has worked against them with respect to getting out on bail.
Yes.
Right? The court's like, no, we suspect that you would do the same thing again, and we don't want this. So the idea is, one, we want to make sure that you appear again, right, for the actual trial or other pretrial hearings, but also the courts don't like disrespect. So if there's an order to appear, then you need to appear. Now, we can say a whole lot of things about freedom and, that kind of thing, but the courts and judges say, look, there's only so many judicial resources that we have. And your date, your trial date, your pretrial hearing date is set on a certain schedule. And if you do not appear during that schedule, you are taking away resources that could be used for something else, right? And it's disrespectful, right? So you're displaying a lack of respect for the judicial process. Now, we can get into a whole debate over like the judicial system, particularly in the United States, and what it lacks and its failures, and all of that is true. But in situations like this, the issue is, hey, what are you doing? We offered you freedom while you're awaiting trial. All we expect for you is to appear, to show up, to get this ball rolling. And if you can't do that, then you're suspicious. And then we may want to hold you to make sure then any other time, any other pretrial hearing, at trial, certainly that you're going to be there to get this done.
And that could be huge here because everybody was hopeful that he would be released immediately. But you got to remember, he jumped bail, and that judge knows that. And that's concerning for the supporters of Julian Assange. And just to give my quick thumbnail, and you can straighten me out on any of this because we've talked about this before, but for folks that may not be familiar or may be a little bit confused about what Assange is being tried for, back in the Bush administration, back in the Iraq War, he released information that he got about war crimes in Iraq, most notably that Apache helicopter video shooting those people on the ground, including 2 Reuters journalists, and the United States have been after him ever since. Obama took a look at it. They probably wanted to get him as well, being an enemy of the United States with the release of that information, they thought. Obama decided not to pursue it because of the precedent with things like the Pentagon Papers and maybe even Watergate to a certain extent. But, I mean, it just didn't seem like they could do anything with it. But they didn't give up on it. Trump has continued to pursue him. He's been held in Europe. He was in the Ecuadorian embassy over there. And so there he sits today, and they're still trying to get him back here. And I don't want people to confuse that because a lot of people think, well, it has to do with Hillary Clinton's emails and the server and the hacking of the DNC. And no, it has nothing to do with that, although it has a lot to do with the sentiment and the dislike for him here in the country. And I guess the other thing that I wanted to have you talk a little bit about again, because God, you know more about this than anybody that I would talk to. A lot of people accuse Assange of not being a journalist, and the judge's ruling kind of talked about this a little, but the way that I put it to people is the dude was given like not the equivalent, but similar to a Pulitzer Prize by the European Union's top journalism folks over there. I mean, he got a huge journalism award. WikiLeaks has never been found to have made an error or a mistake on anything. They've never had to retract anything, mostly because they just repurpose it. It is what it is. And of course, Australia has him in the Journalism Union. Now, he's an Australian. That's where he's at over there. So I'm just kind of disgusted that people still accuse Julian Assange of not being a journalist. Now, he's a publisher, but publishers are journalists. I mean, how do you come down on that?
So in the United States, there's no uniform legal definition of a journalist. Anybody can be a journalist. You just need to publish something, and publishing is broadly defined, right? You could put out an actual newsletter or a pamphlet, right? If you're going old school, you could be on a podcast. You're still a journalist. You could just quite frankly, you have a blog and you could be a journalist, but it's all about distributing information. That information doesn't even have to be correct, quite frankly, at the stage we're in right now. So because there is no legal definition of journalist in the United States, also journalists don't have to be licensed here. Anybody can get into the field. There's no licensure program. Of course, there are professional organizations and professional standards from these organizations, but you don't have to follow them. Nobody's checking. Like, as a lawyer, I'm required to do, some things and make sure I do professional development each year and submit it to the bar, the board of bar examiners, to make sure that I'm continuing to be in good standing and that I'm continuing to learn professionally and develop professionally. Journalists don't have to do that at all. There's nothing that requires them to do. Now, we'd like for people to grow and to learn more and to follow specific ethical guidelines. However, that is not a requirement. So when people say that Assange is not a journalist, what they're saying is, I don't think he is a journalist by my own standards. The problem is your own standards has nothing to do with the law. The law does not care in the United States. And the DOJ and other prosecutors can try that. The problem is that there is precedent in our court cases in the United States that say, no, we're not touching that hot potato of deciding what a journalist is or what can be considered even a news organization, right? Because that then really butts up against what the First Amendment says. And it says, Congress shall make no law, right? And then we get into this free expression clause, about speech or the press, right? So if we start having laws that say, okay, a journalist is defined as this, that really butts up against that, or the press part, and also the speech part as well, right? So the First Amendment demands that, our interpretations, legal interpretations anyway, of who a journalist is and who gets these kinds of protections extends to everybody, right?
Yeah.
And court cases, the U.S. Supreme Court cases have said that journalists are no different than anybody else, right? Now, that's not, those weren't necessarily favorable cases for journalists, but it does demonstrate that anybody then has the same rights as journalists, people who are employed by news organizations or employed as writers or publishers, right? So with Assange, the issue is he's not as likable to a whole swath of people as perhaps would be good for a case such as his. But just because they don't think he's a journalist does not mean legally he can't be considered a journalist, or that that would come into play when or if he ever is tried with respect to American or U.S. law.
Yeah, I tell people all the time, I've got a journalism degree also, but it's basically just whether or not you're reporting what's happening. That makes you a journalist. There's no secret decoder ring for this, folks. And to put it in the most simple of terms, if if the government goes into your neighbor's house and kills your neighbor, you put it on Facebook, guess what? You're a reporter. I mean, you're a journalist at that point. And then if you know somebody, for instance, that works with the ATF, and they tell you that they heard within the ATF that was done on purpose, and you put that again on your Facebook page or do a YouTube video on that, guess what? You have a whistleblower. I mean, and you are a publisher because you put that out there. You are in Julian Assange world. And guess what? If you do that, I can almost guarantee you your door's going to get knocked on. They're going to want to talk to you. They might want to do something to you. Everybody should be concerned about this situation with Julian Assange. One thing I wanted to ask you about, with your knowledge of the law, again, dovetailing with this journalism situation in Europe. My initial reaction on this when I saw it was that judge is kind of saying that our prison system over here is barbaric, and it's an indictment on the federal, anyway, American prison system by wanting to not release him to us. Did you view it that way?
Absolutely. So again, human rights and the rights of possible prisoners come into play a lot in, various European courts. Like, should we extradite that person? What are the possible impacts of sending them to this other country for prosecution? And thinking about what we think over here of cruel and unusual punishment is kind of the idea that some of these courts use when considering whether or not to send folks here for prosecution. If the judge is basically indicting our prison system, particularly federal prisons, but just our prison system in general, she's not wrong. So there's, even here in the United States, there's been a lot of controversies related to prison and punishment and what punishment should be and what prison should be and whether or not there should be prison just as a general matter anyway. But yeah, so she is definitely considered in the human rights element. And, considering whether the impact on Assange would be greater than the possible ramifications for supposedly justice, right? So the United States would say, like, justice demands that we get to prosecute them, but the question is, if we send them, would the damage be way more than what justice demands?
Not only are the prisons barbaric and arcane, but of course, holding someone in solitary confinement, that's the other big part of it. And everybody overlooks that with Julian Assange. My God, the mind-breaking amount of time that man has spent in solitary confinement. Chelsea Manning was tortured in that way also through solitary confinement, his whistleblower. And of course, she did attempt to commit suicide. So there's that precedent there. Well, okay, before I let you go, I kind of wanted to throw out there this one little bit of a conspiracy theory that I have, and you can reel me back in. But I look at this, and folks wonder why England, why the UK, why they would be participating in this with the United States. Well, again, flashback to when this occurred, the Iraq War. Who was our ally, our main ally in the Iraq War? Folks, it was the UK. It was Britain. They were in on this with us. Not only that, but Julian Assange also has revealed information in the past that has been very damaging to them. They don't like that guy either. So I look at this and I think, well, how can they continue to participate in this a little bit under the radar with the United States? And I read into this this current ruling, and I thought, well, one way to do it would be to say, we're all for human rights. We're not going to release him because we're afraid that he'll die in the U.S. prison system. So pat ourselves on the back for doing that. But if Assange doesn't get released, if he continues to be held, maybe in a more humane, maybe in a lesser secure prison in England, the man's not free. I mean, that's the bottom line here. Is that a possibility? Do you think that could be some of the thinking with that judge and with their legal system over there? Or is that just a little too far out there?
So I don't know. Here's the deal. So this has been going on since, as you mentioned, the Bush Jr. administration, or Bush. And so he's been imprisoned, so to speak, for a very long time, meaning his ability to travel, his ability to just move, to be out, without being possibly kidnapped and taken back to someplace, has been so marginal for a very long time. So if imprisonment is the goal, they've done that already. Yeah. If, psychological torture, like you noted, is the goal, there's an argument to be had that they've done that already, right? So I'm not sure about this judge, the UK judge, but I will say that the United States, trail after this guy has made it very hard for him to live a life that is unlike somebody who's in prison. So if they just want his actual body in a physical prison, that's one thing, but they've certainly made him or imprisoned him in other ways already.
And this has been reported also, folks. There are murderers, pedophiles, people that have not spent the amount of time in the circumstances that he has over the last 10 years. So there is that precedent. Well, I just want to tell everybody to support Assange because he has very little support, even in the journalism community. I've talked about that on the podcast before. Why the hell that is, I have no idea. But people say, well, the Democrats will help him. No, the Democrats ain't helping Assange. He revealed those emails, those Podesta emails. That was delivered to him, I think. He's accused of hacking the servers and all that kind of stuff. I mean, they don't like him. The Republicans Republicans are never going to come to his support, obviously. One big reason Trump is not going to pardon Assange, and this gets overlooked all the time. I bring it up. 2017, WikiLeaks put out an all call that said if anyone has any information on Donald Trump's taxes, here is the Dropbox, basically, to put this information. Let us know, and we will release and reveal them. Now, I know that. I'm Podcast by George. You think Donald Trump doesn't know that? They're not about to come to Julian Assange's defense. I hope Trump will do something to help Snowden, because, he's just accused of violating the deep state, basically, and Trump supposedly is against that. But I don't see any support coming from any of those groups. Politics is not going to help him, certainly in this country. Well, again, Dr. McNeely, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast. I want to give you the last word here, because I just, this particular story is right in your sweet spot. Tell us your thoughts here as we wrap up.
Well, I think the overall issue is supportive journalism and journalists, and I should say people doing the work of information distribution. And what kind of system do we want with respect to all of us getting the information that we need to govern ourselves? And I don't just mean voting, although we know that voting has been super important, particularly in the United States, for a long time, but also governing ourselves, like what stuff we should buy or not buy, how we can, make a greater impact on our society, and just, things that we need to know to be fully formed folks and living in this space. And so just being supportive of actual information distribution, and also critically considering other information, the fake news or the information that is not true that is going out. And I don't mean information that we disagree with, but what I mean is information that is blatantly just a lie. So critically considering that and mitigating the impacts and effects of those things, right? So to do that, I think it's important that we really support information distribution folks while we have the chance. So.
Well, and accurate information, as I said earlier.
Absolutely.
WikiLeaks has never found to have been wrong about anything. They've never had to retract or correct anything. Here our country is enraged, and every day you'll hear people complaining about fake news. Folks, here's some real news that you can get behind and support. And the persecution of Assange, to me, just furthers the cause or the viability of fake news. I mean, you got to get behind people that are doing it right and telling the truth, and don't make it all about, God, we've become a society of likes. It doesn't matter whether or not you like Julian Assange. That's not the point here. Or that you like the fact that he released, you're a Democrat and you don't like the fact that he released those emails, or whatever the case might be. Get behind real journalism and real truth tellers like Julian Assange. Dr. McNeely, thanks again for coming on a podcast by George.
Again, thank you for having me.
Dr. Jasmine McNeely is an associate professor in the Department of Telecommunications at the University of Florida's College of Journalism and Communication. She's a friend of Podcast by George, and I'm just delighted to have her on the show to talk about the ongoing case, and it's still ongoing, the trial and tribulations of Julian Assange. And folks, if you like Podcast by George, please subscribe to us if you're seeing this on YouTube. Ring that notification bell. Like us on Facebook, talking about likes. You can follow us on Twitter. We're also on iTunes, Spotify, and everywhere that podcasts are seen or heard. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.